What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Not a Historian. After a long hiatus, we finally returned to our communism series. We're done with the USSR, so we're going to move on to a different communist state during the 20th century, and that is going to be East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. So let's dive right in. So World War II's just ended. The Nazi German regime is devastated and it surrenders. Okay? German territories were occupied according to what the Allies decided at the Yalta Conference in early 1945. So you've got the British in the northwest, the Americans in the south, the French in the southwest, and the Polish in the far east, and then you've got the Soviet occupation zone in the east central portion of the country. And it's important to note that not only was the overall territory partitioned, but the city of Berlin was partitioned between the Allies as well. Now, while the Western Allies nurtured a strong, prosperous country, rebuilding its economy through programs like the Marshall Plan, the Soviets cracked down hard. They wanted a weakened Germany that could never threaten Russia again. So what happened was that they dismantled much of East Germany's remaining industrial capabilities, which wasn't much considering that, the Allies had bombed it to rubble during the war. But the Soviets took apart what was left and carted it all back home to Russia as a war indemnity, um, which of course further devastated the East German economy. I mean, they had pretty much no industrial capability left, so their economy was basically just non-existent at this point. Another thing the Soviets did was they took the German Communist Party, the KPD, and the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, and they combined it into the Socialist Unity Party, and they installed it as the de facto rulers of their occupation zones. So this East German occupation zone became a Soviet-based one-party Marxist-Leninist government, a satellite puppet regime of the Soviet Union. Nominally, East Germany became independent on the 7th of October 1949, but it was still basically controlled by Moscow. It was still a puppet regime and would remain a puppet regime for the rest of its history. So like I said earlier, the East German economy struggled severely. Like there was no industry. East Germany didn't also had like no natural resources. It had food shortages due to the war and also widespread poverty. Now, the Soviets installed a certain Walter Ulbricht as the head of the Socialist Unity Party, and thus, by extension, the de facto head of East Germany. And Ulbricht decided that the best way to fix the situation was a good old fashioned, typical Stalinist 5-year plan. And of course, this 5-year plan had much of the same consequences as Stalin's actual 5-year plans had back in the 1930s. You can go check out my video on that. So East Germany suffered, food shortages due to the collectivization of agriculture. There were high taxes on things like consumer goods. There were also high worker quotas, right? And the high worker quotas in particular sparked the East German uprising of 1953, in which East Germans across, East Germany, rose up in protest against the communist regime. Ulbricht had to call in the Soviets, and they brutally repressed it in June of 1953. There was also the Stasi, which was basically the East German version of the KGB, right? It was extremely notorious for being literally everywhere all the time. So if you lived in East Germany, then it constantly monitored what you did and what you said, and if they thought that you were against the regime, then they would brutally torture you and interrogate you and do all sorts of bad things to you. And so all these factors combined together, and they forced people to leave East Germany during the 1950s. In fact, millions of people would escape East Germany for the West, and this created a sort of brain drain for East Germany, and it didn't really help their situation as intellectuals and workers they just left and deprived East Germany of a lot of economic capability, as much of the population sort of just disappeared. Now, we can't talk about a Soviet satellite state without going over the Cold War. And Germany was a particular focus of the Cold War. It began before East Germany was even a country, back when it was still a Soviet occupation zone, during the Berlin Airlift, in which, in response to the West introducing a new currency to, the German occupation zones, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, which was occupied by the Western Allies, the US, France, and the UK. And the West Berliners were very low on food and other supplies, right? So they were going to starve, they were going to run out of power. Now, the Western Allies couldn't force the Soviets to move the blockade because, they couldn't. These were the Soviets we're talking about, the new superpower. So what they decided to do was they sent in their cargo planes to drop the supplies into Berlin by air. The planes, they'd come in, they'd land at Tempelhof Airport, and then the supplies would be unloaded, and within 30 minutes, the planes would be ready to go, and they would fly off to where they came from to, stock up on more supplies. This was a round-the-clock, 24/7 operation. And this was actually pretty effective. They actually brought in enough food and supplies to keep West Berlin from starving. And the Soviets, their blockade was pointless now because it wasn't working. So they were forced to lift it. Another high point in the Cold War happened in 1961, also at Berlin. This was after the Western Allied occupation zones became West Germany, and the Soviet occupation zone became East Germany, right? So this was 1961, and the Soviets told the Americans and other Western allies to get out of Berlin in an attempt to reunify the city. The US naturally said no, and they rolled up their tanks to one of the checkpoints in October as a show of force. The Soviets did the same, and there was this really tense standoff at a place known as Checkpoint Charlie, where American and Russian tanks stood face to face, and any wrong move could set off World War III. It could set off nuclear war if anyone made the wrong decision. However, the Americans and Soviets were able to work it out, and slowly, very gradually, the tanks left Checkpoint Charlie, and the situation was diffused. One thing that came out of this Berlin crisis, though, was that in August, Walter Ulbricht ordered West Berlin to be surrounded with barbed wire. This barbed wire later grew into a concrete wall with a pipe on top and, a kill zone and searchlights and search towers with armed guards and dogs. The Berlin Wall. And this wall drastically reduced the amount of people who attempted to escape East Germany via West Berlin. But in doing so, it separated families and loved ones, and it became a symbol of the repressive and autocratic nature of the communist regime. It proved to the world that they couldn't even trust their own people to stay inside their borders. And for many years, this became a point of tension for the Cold War. It became a symbol of the Cold War, right? Famously, JFK and Ronald Reagan, two presidents of the United States, they came to West Berlin and made these famous speeches regarding Berlin and the Cold War. Like, Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." JFK said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." And these were rallying points for the NATO Western cause. In the 1960s, the economy of East Berlin started to gradually improve. Now, this brain drain had stopped. Uh, the East German economy was able to, gradually recover. More consumer goods started to be produced, although the government still had heavy control over those, and the citizens themselves didn't have much direct access to them. Um, there was also greater Western influence within East Germany, especially among the younger generation, who became more and more, rebellious and, well, influenced by this Western culture. And also, during this period of time, the 70s and 80s, East Germany racked up a lot of foreign debt. It had tried to export its way out of this foreign debt, however, that required importing more and more natural resources and things like that, and that just drained what resources it had left. In the meantime, the Soviets under Gorbachev were implementing a series of reforms, glasnost and perestroika, openness and transparency. And the USSR tried to get East Germany to do the same, right? Openness and transparency, guys. Now, East Germany was led by the hardliner Erich Honecker. And Honecker was like, "No, I'll think about it." But, of course he didn't. He was a hardliner. He was a hardliner Stalinist. And so this led to mass protests in 1989, calling for reform. And this directly led to the border between West and East Germany to be opened in November, and the Berlin Wall to be knocked down on the 9th of November, 1989. Free elections were held in 1990, and finally, on October the 3rd, 1990, West and East Germany became reunited. That's it for today. Hope you liked it. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see